Within 12 hours of my daughter's family abandoning me at Union Station in the pouring rain, Sarah was desperately calling me after seeing my Instagram story from the luxury first-class cabin on the same train they were riding in coach, watching me toast with champagne while explaining to my 47,000 followers how her family had left their 70-year-old mother standing in a thunderstorm because helping me with my suitcase would have made them miss their connection. But by then, I'd already canceled the $18,000 European river cruise I'd been secretly funding for their dream anniversary trip, frozen the business loan I'd been quietly backing for Sarah's boutique, and posted a follow-up video that was trending with Goward train station grandma, showing me enjoying a 5-course meal in the dining car while her family ate gas station sandwiches 3 cars behind me. Before we dive into how I transformed from abandoned grandmother to first-class queen in less than 24 hours, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear will completely change how you think about family boundaries and the power of strategic consequences. And while you're clicking that subscribe button, ring that notification bell, because this channel is dedicated to stories that prove something most people never realize. Age isn't weakness. It's decades of accumulated wisdom, resources, and the kind of strategic thinking that only comes from a lifetime of watching entitled people reveal their true character when they think you're powerless to respond. Now, I want you to pause for a moment and think about this question. Have you ever been left behind by people who claim to love you? Have you ever been treated like an inconvenience by the very people you've spent years supporting, helping, and sacrificing for? Have you ever stood somewhere, whether it's a train platform, an airport, or even a family gathering, wondering how the people you've loved most could simply walk away when helping you became slightly more effort than they wanted to make? Drop your answer in the comments below, because I read every single one, and your experiences matter. This isn't just entertainment. This is a masterclass in recognizing when kindness becomes exploitation, and more importantly, how to reclaim your power when family members mistake your generosity for guaranteed availability. And if you've never experienced this kind of abandonment personally, stick around, because this story will show you exactly how to spot the warning signs before you find yourself standing in the rain like I did. This story is about the Tuesday afternoon when I learned that 4 years of funding family vacations, business ventures, and emergency expenses meant nothing when my presence became inconvenient for my daughter's family at Chicago's Union Station. When I discovered that the child I'd raised to value loyalty and compassion had married a man who saw me as nothing more than a financial resource to be managed around their convenient schedules. But let me tell you something crucial before we dive into how I went from rain-soaked grandmother to viral sensation in less than 48 hours. This isn't a story about revenge, though I certainly got satisfaction from watching my daughter and son-in-law panic when they realized what they'd lost. This isn't about being vindictive, though the consequences I delivered were swift and perfectly proportional. This is about understanding that respect isn't optional in family relationships. It's the foundation that determines whether your love and generosity create healthy connections or enable toxic behavior. My name is Eleanor Catherine Whitmore, and I'm 70 years old. For the past 5 years, I'd been living independently in a beautiful Victorian home in Evanston, Illinois, just 30 minutes from my daughter Sarah and her family in downtown Chicago. The arrangement had seemed perfect when I'd first moved. From my longtime residence in Boston after my husband Robert's passing, I could maintain my independence while being close enough to help with my grandchildren, 12-year-old Victoria and 9-year-old James, and be part of their lives in whatever way felt natural and meaningful. But before I became the inconvenient grandmother who could be abandoned at a train station when my pace didn't match their urgency, let me tell you about the life I built and the resources I accumulated that would eventually become the foundation of my power to change everything in one strategic afternoon. I was born Eleanor Catherine Sullivan in 1954, the daughter of a working-class Irish family in South Boston, who believed that education, hard work, and taking care of your own were the 3 pillars that separated surviving from thriving. My father, Patrick, worked as a union electrician for the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, while my mother, Kathleen, managed our household of 5 children with the kind of efficiency and discipline that would make a Fortune 500 CEO envious. Our small 2-family house in Southie was always filled with the sounds of homework being done, chores being completed, and the kind of conversations that taught us children that respect was earned through character, not demanded through authority. Growing up in Boston during the 1960s and 70s taught me lessons that would serve me throughout my life, though I didn't understand their full value at the time. We lived in a neighborhood where everyone looked out for everyone else's children, where favors were exchanged without keeping score, and where your reputation was built through consistency and reliability rather than what you owned or who you knew. It was also a world where money was always carefully managed, where opportunities had to be earned through merit and persistence, and where planning for the future required strategic thinking about education, career choices, and building the kind of security that couldn't be taken away by other people's decisions. My parents had immigrated from County Kerry in Ireland during the 1940s, arriving in Boston with nothing but determination and a work ethic that would eventually allow them to purchase that 2-family house and send all 5 children to college. They'd met at a church social for Irish immigrants, married after a courtship that lasted 4 years while they both saved money and established themselves in their new country, building the kind of foundation that could support not just their own dreams, but their children's futures. Patrick Sullivan had found work with the Transit Authority within 6 weeks of arriving in America, starting as a track maintenance worker and working his way up to senior electrician through 15 years of showing up early, staying late, and treating every task as an opportunity to prove his value to supervisors who were initially skeptical about hiring recent immigrants. He understood that success in America required not just hard work, but strategic thinking about how to build respect and opportunity over time. "Eleanor," my father would say when I complained about having to work part-time jobs during high school, while my wealthier classmates spent their afternoons shopping or socializing, money that you earn through your own effort is money that gives you choices. But money that you depend on other people to provide can disappear as quickly as it appeared, usually when you need it most. That lesson, that financial independence was the foundation of all other forms of independence, would shape every major decision I made throughout my adult life. It would influence my choice to continue working even after Sarah was born, my insistence on maintaining my own investment accounts even during the years when Robert's income could have supported our entire family, and my careful planning for retirement that had allowed me to maintain my dignity and independence even after Robert's death 5 years ago. Kathleen Sullivan had taken work as a seamstress for wealthy families in Beacon Hill, creating beautiful clothing and doing alterations while learning English and observing how successful American families managed their households, raised their children, and built intergenerational wealth. She'd saved every penny she could from her wages, living with relatives for the first 3 years while accumulating the money that would eventually become the down payment on the house where I grew up. But more importantly, she'd studied the families she worked for, learning the difference between families who maintained their wealth and happiness across generations and those who lost both through poor character and lack of respect for each other. "Eleanor," my mother would tell me as I helped her prepare dinner each evening, watching her hands work efficiently while her mind processed the day's observations. "Money can solve many problems, but it cannot solve the problem of people who don't value each other properly. The families I work for who are truly happy are the ones where everyone treats everyone else with kindness and consideration, regardless of who earns the money or who makes the decisions. The families who struggle are the ones where people take each other for granted." That lesson, that respect and consideration were the foundation of healthy relationships, would become the standard by which I measured all my important relationships throughout my life. It would guide my expectations for marriage, my approach to raising Sarah, and eventually, my recognition of when family relationships had become unhealthy enough to require immediate and decisive intervention. By the time I was old enough to understand adult conversations, my parents had achieved a level of financial security that allowed them to focus on their children's education and future opportunities rather than basic survival. But they never forgot the lessons they'd learned during those early years of struggle, and they made sure their children understood that security was something that had to be earned and protected through careful planning, consistent effort, and never taking other people's kindness or generosity for granted. The neighborhood where I grew up was filled with families like ours, first- and second-generation immigrants who understood that America offered opportunities, but that those opportunities had to be seized through education, hard work, and building the kind of character that made other people want to trust you with responsibility and respect. We learned that success wasn't just about individual achievement, but about lifting up your family and community through your own efforts and integrity. During high school, while working part-time at Sullivan's Corner Market to help with family expenses and save for college, I watched different types of customers interact with my boss, Mr. Sullivan, no relation despite the shared name. The customers who were consistently polite and respectful got better service, better prices, and extra help when they needed it. The customers who were demanding, dismissive, or who acted entitled to special treatment found themselves receiving exactly the minimum required service and nothing more. People respond to how you treat them, Mr. Sullivan told me one afternoon after a particularly rude customer had stormed out angry about our prices. If you treat people like they don't matter, they'll treat you like you don't matter. If you treat people with respect, most of them will give you respect in return. But here's the important part, Eleanor. You can't control how other people behave, but you can control how you respond to their behavior. That observation would prove crucial decades later when I found myself standing in the rain at Union Station, forced to decide how to respond to my own family's decision to treat me like I didn't matter. I met my husband, Robert James Whitmore, when I was 28 and working as a financial analyst at Fidelity Investments in Boston. I'd earned my degree in economics from Boston College through a combination of academic scholarships, part-time work, and careful financial planning that allowed me to graduate debt-free in 1976. Robert was 31, a civil engineer with dreams of building sustainable infrastructure projects and helping communities develop the kind of long-term planning that created prosperity, rather than just temporary economic growth. What attracted me to Robert wasn't just his intelligence or his professional success, though both were impressive. What drew me to him was the way he listened when I talked about my family, my work, and my own dreams for the future. He was genuinely interested in my opinions about things that mattered to both of us, and he treated my goals and preferences as equally important to his own when we discussed the kind of life we might build together. Most importantly, he understood that my commitment to maintaining my own career and financial independence wasn't a reflection of distrust in his ability to provide for our family, but rather a reflection of values that had been shaped by my parents' experiences as immigrants who'd had to build security from nothing. During our 4-year courtship, Robert demonstrated the qualities that would make him not just a good husband, but a true partner in building the kind of life that would honor both our family's sacrifices and our own dreams for the future. He was the kind of man who remembered what I'd told him about my family's history and my parents' struggles, and who understood that respect and consideration weren't just nice touches in a relationship. They were fundamental requirements that determined whether love could flourish or would eventually be destroyed by taking each other for granted. When Robert proposed in April 1982, he did so with a speech that convinced me he understood not just what I wanted from marriage, but why those things were important to me and how they connected to the values that had shaped my character. "Eleanor," he had said, holding my hands on the steps of the Boston Public Library where we'd had our first official date, "I want to build something with you that our children will be proud to inherit, not just in terms of money or property, but in terms of the values and the love that will be the foundation of everything we create together. I want us to be the kind of couple who still treats each other with kindness and respect when we're 70, Not because we have to, but because we've never forgotten that choosing to love someone means choosing to value them every single day. We married at St. Monica's Cathedral in South Boston in September 1982, in a ceremony that represented everything hopeful about young love combined with careful planning and realistic expectations. The wedding wasn't elaborate by today's standards, but it was perfect in the way that matters most. It was a celebration of two people who genuinely understood what they were promising each other and had the character and practical skills to honor those promises through whatever challenges life might bring. The early years of our marriage had been challenging in the way that builds character rather than destroying it. Robert's position as a junior civil engineer with the Massachusetts Department of Transportation provided a steady but modest income, while my role as a financial analyst at Fidelity contributed enough to allow us to save aggressively for the future we were planning. We lived carefully but not miserably, spending money on experiences and investments that would build our foundation rather than on luxuries that would provide temporary pleasure but no lasting value. But what made those early years special wasn't the financial discipline or the practical skills we were developing. It was the way we approached every decision as a team, with each person's opinions and preferences given equal weight in creating the life we were building together. We never fell into the trap of assuming that one person's convenience mattered more than the other's, or that one person's contributions to our partnership were more valuable than the other's. When Sarah was born in March 1985, Robert and I were ready for parenthood in all the ways that mattered. We had established ourselves financially, we had created a stable home environment, and we had developed the kind of partnership that would allow us to raise a child with consistent values and expectations while also giving her the love, attention, and opportunities she would need to develop her own personality and interests. But even before Sarah was born, Robert and I had been planning for the move to Chicago that would eventually take us away from the Boston area where both our families lived. Robert had been offered a senior position with the Chicago Department of Public Works, a growing agency that specialized in sustainable infrastructure development for one of America's most important cities. The opportunity represented everything we'd been working toward, a chance for Robert to build his own reputation in his field, while creating the kind of financial security that would allow us to provide Sarah with opportunities neither of us had enjoyed during our own childhoods. The decision to leave Boston wasn't easy, and it wasn't made quickly. It meant leaving both our extended families and the community connections that had provided security and familiarity throughout our young adult years. But Robert and I had spent months researching the opportunity, visiting Chicago, and developing a comprehensive plan that would allow us to pursue our professional goals while building the kind of family life that honored both our values about community, stability, and putting family relationships first. When we moved to Chicago in September 1986, Sarah was 18 months old, and I was 6 months pregnant with hopes and dreams that would shape the next 30 years of our lives. We bought a beautiful 3-bedroom bungalow in Lincoln Park, in a neighborhood where young families with children were creating the kind of close-knit community that felt like a modern version of the supportive Boston neighborhoods we'd left. Behind Chicago in the mid-1980s was a city rebuilding itself with intelligence and strategic vision, growing thoughtfully as Mayor Harold Washington's administration focused on sustainable development and creating opportunities for working families who wanted to build something lasting rather than just pursue quick financial gains. Robert's career flourished as he built a reputation for innovative infrastructure projects that served communities for decades rather than just meeting immediate political or economic pressures. I found fulfilling work as a portfolio manager for Northern Trust, which allowed me to maintain my career and financial independence while having a schedule that aligned with Sarah's educational needs and our family priorities. For the next 25 years, Robert and I built the kind of life that represented everything we'd hoped for when we'd made the difficult decision to leave our families and friends in Boston. We paid off our mortgage early through disciplined saving and strategic refinancing. We built substantial investment portfolios through careful research and long-term thinking. Most importantly, we created the kind of stable, loving home environment where Sarah could develop her own personality and interests while being shaped by values that would serve her well throughout her life. Sarah thrived in Chicago from the very beginning. She was an excellent student who loved learning for its own sake, not just for grades or recognition. She was a natural leader who excelled at debate team and student government, but who also treated classmates with kindness regardless of their social status or academic performance. She had inherited her father's analytical thinking and attention to detail, combined with my ability to connect with people from all backgrounds and circumstances. She was popular without being arrogant, successful without being competitive with her friends, and had the kind of character that made other parents comment about what a wonderful young woman the Whitmore family had raised. Sarah's high school years were filled with the kind of achievements and experiences that made Robert and me proud not just of her accomplishments, but of the person she was becoming. She volunteered at local community centers, tutored younger students who were struggling academically, and showed the kind of consideration for others that suggested she truly understood the values we'd tried to teach her about treating people with respect and kindness. When Sarah graduated from high school as salutatorian and received a substantial academic scholarship to Northwestern University's business program, Robert and I felt like all our sacrifices and careful planning had been validated. We were proud parents who'd raised a daughter capable of building on the foundation we'd provided while creating her own version of success and happiness. During Sarah's junior year at Northwestern, she met Michael Rodriguez, a marketing major from a wealthy Winnetka family who owned a successful chain of high-end furniture stores throughout the Midwest. Michael was handsome, intelligent, articulate, and came from the kind of established Chicago family that could provide Sarah with social and professional connections that would enhance whatever career path she chose to pursue after graduation. Sarah brought Michael home for the first time during Thanksgiving break in 2006. I was immediately impressed by his confidence, his intelligence, and his apparent genuine affection for my daughter. He seemed interested in our family history, asked thoughtful questions about our move from Boston and our experiences building a life in Chicago, and expressed what appeared to be sincere appreciation for the values that had shaped Sarah's character and guided our family decisions. "I can see where Sarah gets her integrity and her work ethic," Michael had said during that first dinner, looking directly at Robert and me with what seemed like genuine respect and gratitude. "You and Mr. Whitmore have raised someone really special, and I want you to know that I don't take that for granted." At the time, I'd treasured that comment as evidence that Michael understood and valued what Robert and I had tried to accomplish as parents, and that he recognized the effort and sacrifice that goes into raising a child with strong character and clear values. Looking back now, with the wisdom that comes from 18 years of observing Michael's actual behavior versus his carefully crafted words, I can see that Michael was already demonstrating the skill he would later use to manipulate family dynamics. The ability to say exactly what people wanted to hear while privately calculating how their relationships and resources could be used to advance his own interests and convenience. But during those early years of Sarah and Michael's relationship, and throughout their engagement and the first decade of their marriage, Michael had maintained the facade of being someone who valued family relationships and understood the importance of treating people with consideration and respect. The warning signs had been subtle, and they'd developed gradually enough that they'd been easy to rationalize or overlook. The wedding in June 2008 had taken place at the prestigious Palmer House Hotel in downtown Chicago, with 200 guests, flowers that cost more than Robert and I had spent on our entire wedding, and a reception that was featured in Chicago Magazine's society pages. I was proud to be the mother of the bride, grateful that Sarah had found love with someone who clearly adored her, and who came from a family that appeared to share our values about supporting each other and building something meaningful together. But even during the wedding planning process, There had been signs that I should have recognized as warnings about how Michael's family viewed relationships and social dynamics, and how they understood the balance between generosity and respect. Michael's family had dominated the guest list, filling nearly 2/3 of the venue with their extensive social and business networks, while Sarah's side had included Robert and me, a few college friends, some co-workers from her first job at a Chicago marketing firm, and several empty tables that highlighted the difference between our social circles and the Rodriguez family's extensive community connections. During the reception, Michael's mother, Carmen, had introduced me to other guests as Sarah's mother, the portfolio manager, while she introduced her own family and friends with detailed descriptions of their business achievements, social positions, and community involvement. The introductions weren't intentionally dismissive, but they reflected a subtle hierarchy that positioned the Whitmore family as Sarah's past, while the Rodriguez family represented her future and her primary social identity. The first few years of Sarah and Michael's marriage had seemed to confirm my optimism about their relationship and my hopes for Sarah's happiness. Michael had been warm and inclusive toward Robert and me, inviting us to family celebrations and holiday gatherings, including us in their social activities, and seeming genuinely grateful for any help we provided during the early months of adjusting to married life and managing a household while both partners were establishing their careers. When Victoria was born in 2010, 3 years after the wedding, Michael had actively sought my advice and assistance with everything from sleep schedules and feeding routines to managing the anxiety and exhaustion that comes with first-time parenthood. I had spent countless hours helping with the kind of practical support that makes the transition to parenthood manageable: meal preparation, laundry, overnight care that allowed new parents to get enough rest to function during the demanding early months, and the emotional support that comes from having experienced family members available to provide reassurance and guidance. "Eleanor, I don't know what we'd do without you," Michael had said repeatedly during Victoria's infancy, seeming genuinely appreciative of my willingness to prioritize their family's needs and my ability to provide the kind of help that made their lives significantly easier. Having an experienced mother nearby has made this transition so much smoother than it would have been if we were trying to figure everything out on our own. When James had arrived in 2013, the pattern had repeated, with me providing intensive support during the challenging months of adjusting to life with 2 young children under the age of 3. Michael had continued to express what appeared to be genuine appreciation for my help, and Sarah had regularly told me how grateful she was for my willingness to be so involved in their family's life. Robert's death 5 years ago had changed everything about my situation and my relationship with Sarah's family in ways that I hadn't fully understood at the time. Robert had been my partner, my best friend, my strongest advocate in family situations, and my buffer in social interactions where I felt uncertain about family dynamics or social expectations. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep from a heart attack at age 72, I lost not just my husband, but also my primary source of emotional support and my strongest voice in family discussions and decisions. The grief had been overwhelming, but Sarah and Michael had been wonderfully supportive during those first difficult months. They'd helped with funeral arrangements, assisted with legal and financial paperwork, and had included me in family activities in ways that made me feel like I was still part of a loving, connected family unit, even without Robert's presence and guidance. When I'd decided to sell our Lincoln Park home, the house held too many memories, and maintaining it alone felt overwhelming, both emotionally and practically. Sarah had suggested that I consider moving closer to their family, rather than staying isolated in a house that was too large and too filled with reminders of my loss. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone during this transition," Sarah had said, as we'd discussed my housing options over dinner at their house, with Victoria and James playing quietly nearby. Evanston has some beautiful neighborhoods with gorgeous Victorian homes where you could have your own space and independence, but also be close enough to be part of our daily lives in whatever way feels comfortable for everyone. The Victorian house in Evanston had seemed perfect when Sarah and Michael had toured it with me. The house was spacious and elegant, with 4 bedrooms, a full gourmet kitchen, a library that could serve as my home office, and a beautiful garden that would give me a peaceful outdoor space for reading and relaxation. The neighborhood was filled with other independent seniors and young families, creating the kind of intergenerational community that felt both safe and socially engaging. Eleanor's story demonstrates what happens when that respect disappears entirely. When one person's needs and feelings become completely irrelevant to the other people in the relationship, and when kindness and generosity get reframed as obligations rather than choices that deserve appreciation. More importantly, it shows us what's possible when someone who's been systematically devalued finally decides that preserving their own dignity is more important than preserving an artificial peace that requires them to accept unacceptable treatment. The reason Eleanor's response was so effective wasn't primarily because she was wealthy, though her financial resources certainly gave her options that not everyone has. And we'll talk about how to adapt these principles even when you don't have significant financial leverage. The reason her response worked was because she understood something that most people in her situation never figure out until it's too late. Respect isn't something you can beg for, negotiate for, or earn through increasingly desperate acts of service and self-sacrifice. Respect is something you have to require, and sometimes requiring respect means demonstrating exactly what life looks like when people lose access to the benefits they've been taking for granted. Now, I know some of you are thinking, but Eleanor, family is family. Shouldn't she have tried to work things out? Shouldn't she have given Sarah and Michael another chance to understand how their behavior was affecting her? Shouldn't she have been more patient and understanding about the pressures of modern family life? And those are fair questions that deserve honest, thoughtful answers because they reflect beliefs that many of us have been taught about family relationships and unconditional love. The reality is that Eleanor had been trying to work things out for 4 years since Robert's death. She'd been giving Sarah and Michael chances to recognize how their behavior was changing, to acknowledge her feelings and needs, and to treat her with the consideration that any human being deserves, let alone a mother and grandmother who'd been financially supporting their lifestyle and providing countless hours of free childcare and household help. Eleanor hadn't jumped straight to consequences without trying normal relationship communication first. She'd started with gentle conversations about feeling taken for granted. She'd tried expressing her feelings directly about being excluded from family decisions that affected her. She'd attempted to address the problems through the kind of honest communication that healthy relationships require. But what she'd discovered, what many people in similar situations eventually discover, is that some people interpret attempts at communication as opportunities to explain why your feelings are wrong, why your expectations are unreasonable, or why you should be grateful for whatever level of consideration they feel like providing. When Eleanor had tried to talk to Sarah about feeling like her role in their family had shifted from valued family member to convenient service provider, Sarah's response had been to minimize Eleanor's feelings and make excuses for Michael's increasingly demanding behavior. When she'd expressed hurt about being expected to provide childcare without being consulted about her own schedule and preferences, she'd been told she was being too sensitive and that she should appreciate being needed by her family. When she'd pointed out that her financial contributions were being treated as expectations rather than appreciated as the extraordinary generosity they actually represented, she'd been reminded of how much the family valued her without any acknowledgement that their behavior needed to change. This is a pattern that many of you will recognize from your own lives, whether it's happening in your family relationships, friendships, workplace dynamics, or romantic partnerships. It's what happens when someone has decided, either consciously or unconsciously, that your role in their life is to provide services, support, resources, or emotional labor while requiring minimal consideration, appreciation, or reciprocity in return. They're not necessarily aware that they've made this decision, and they might even be genuinely shocked when you point out the imbalance. Often, they've simply gotten comfortable with an arrangement that benefits them significantly, and they've stopped thinking about whether it's fair to you or sustainable for the relationship. The insidious thing about this dynamic is that it usually develops gradually, so gradually that both people can miss the warning signs until the relationship has become fundamentally unhealthy. It starts with small requests that seem perfectly reasonable. Can you help with this project? Can you watch the kids for a few hours? Can you contribute to this expense because you're in a better financial position? These requests are often framed as temporary situations or special circumstances that require extra support. The problem develops when your helpful responses to these reasonable requests get reinterpreted as evidence that you're available for similar requests in the future, and that you're comfortable with this level of contribution to the other person's life. Your generosity becomes their expectation. Your availability becomes their assumption. Your willingness to help becomes their entitlement to your time, energy, and resources. The progression continues when your attempts to set any boundaries or express any needs of your own get treated as problems to be managed rather than legitimate concerns to be addressed. You might hear responses like, "I thought you enjoyed helping out," or "You never seemed to mind before," or "I didn't realize this was such a big deal for you." These responses sound reasonable on the surface, but they're actually ways of avoiding responsibility for the impact of their behavior on your life and well-being. Eleanor's situation with Sarah and Michael is a perfect example of how this progression works in family relationships. It had started with Eleanor offering to help with childcare during the stressful early months of parenthood, offering being the key word. These were choices Eleanor made because she loved her family and wanted to support them during challenging transitions that most new parents struggle with. But over the course of 4 years, Eleanor's helpful choices had been gradually reframed as grandmotherly obligations. Her generous financial contributions had been recontextualized as Eleanor's decisions rather than acknowledged as gifts that significantly improved Sarah and Michael's quality of life and provided them with opportunities they couldn't have afforded on their own. Her presence in their lives had been repositioned from valued family member to convenient resource that could be utilized when beneficial and ignored or abandoned when inconvenient. The train station abandonment hadn't been an isolated incident of poor judgment during a stressful travel day. It had been the inevitable result of 4 years of systematic devaluation that had finally reached the point where Sarah and Michael felt comfortable treating Eleanor with open disregard rather than the subtle manipulation and gradual boundary erosion that had characterized the earlier stages of this unhealthy dynamic. What's crucial to understand about Eleanor's story is that people who exploit others' kindness rarely see themselves as exploitative, and they're often genuinely surprised when their behavior is labeled as such. Sarah and Michael didn't wake up one morning and decide to mistreat Eleanor or take advantage of her generosity. Instead, they gradually adjusted their expectations and behaviors in response to Eleanor's continued availability and willingness to help, until they reached a point where they simply expected her to prioritize their convenience over her own dignity, comfort, and needs. This is why attempting to solve these problems through conversation alone is often ineffective, especially once the dynamic has become entrenched over months or years. When someone has convinced themselves, consciously or unconsciously, that your role is to accommodate their needs while they accommodate nothing in return, they're usually not open to feedback about how this dynamic is unfair, unsustainable, or harmful to your relationship. Instead, they're likely to respond to your concerns with explanations about why their needs are more important, why your expectations are unreasonable, or why you should be grateful for the opportunity to serve their family. Eleanor had experienced exactly this type of response when she'd tried to address her growing concerns with Sarah over the months leading up to the train station incident. Instead of acknowledgement that her mother's feelings mattered and that the family's behavior needed adjustment, she'd received lectures about being more understanding of the challenges of parenting and managing a busy household. Instead of recognition that being abandoned at a train station was completely unacceptable regardless of the circumstances, She was later told she was making a bigger deal out of the situation than necessary, and that she should have been more understanding about travel logistics and tight schedules. This type of response reveals something important about how Sarah and Michael had come to view Eleanor's role in their lives over the 4 years since Robert's death. They weren't interested in her feedback about their treatment of her, because they didn't see her as someone whose opinions about their behavior mattered in any meaningful way. They saw her as someone whose function was to provide support, resources, and services while accepting whatever level of consideration they felt like offering in return, which was increasingly minimal. Understanding this dynamic is crucial because it explains why Eleanor's strategic response was not only justified, but necessary for any hope of restoring health to these family relationships. When someone has decided that your feelings don't matter enough to influence their behavior in any significant way, communication alone will not restore respect and consideration to the relationship. What's required is a clear demonstration that treating you badly has consequences they care about more than they care about treating you well. Eleanor's decision to upgrade her travel experience and share her story publicly wasn't revenge in the petty or vindictive sense. It was education. She was teaching Sarah and Michael something they'd apparently forgotten during the 4 years of taking her for granted: that her presence in their lives was a choice she was making, not an obligation she owed them. That her financial support was generosity she was providing, not an entitlement they could expect regardless of how they treated the person providing it. And that respecting her dignity wasn't an optional extra in their relationship. It was the basic price of admission to the benefits she'd been providing. The brilliant thing about Eleanor's approach, which we'll see in detail as the story continues, was that it was completely proportional and entirely within her rights as an independent adult with her own resources and agency. She didn't do anything illegal, unethical, or even particularly harsh. She simply stopped providing benefits to people who demonstrated they didn't value the person providing them. She withdrew her financial support from people who'd shown they were willing to abandon her when her presence became slightly inconvenient. And she shared her experience publicly, not to shame them, but to demonstrate that seniors don't have to accept mistreatment just because the mistreatment is coming from family members. But Eleanor's story also demonstrates something else that's crucial for anyone who's dealing with similar situations in their own lives: the importance of having options when you finally reach the point where you can no longer accept unacceptable treatment. Eleanor was able to respond strategically to Sarah and Michael's behavior because she had maintained her financial independence, because she'd preserved her own social connections and interests, and because she understood her own worth regardless of how her family was treating her. Too often, people find themselves trapped in exploitative relationships because they've allowed themselves to become completely dependent on the people who are mistreating them. They've given up their financial independence, isolated themselves from other relationships and social connections, or convinced themselves that maintaining family connections is worth accepting any level of disrespect, inconsideration, or emotional harm. Eleanor's story shows us a different model for how to be generous and supportive while maintaining the independence and self-respect that make healthy relationships possible. She'd maintained her financial independence while being extraordinarily generous with her resources. She'd preserved her own identity, interests, and social connections while being supportive and available to her family. She'd kept her options open while being consistently helpful and accommodating to people she loved. This meant that when Sarah and Michael finally crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, when they demonstrated that their comfort and convenience mattered more to them than her basic dignity as a human being, Eleanor had the resources, freedom, and self-respect necessary to respond in ways that created real consequences for their behavior, rather than just expressing hurt feelings that they could ignore or dismiss. For those of you who are currently in situations where you feel taken for granted by family members, friends, romantic partners, or others in your life, Eleanor's story offers both inspiration and practical guidance that you can adapt to your own circumstances and resources. The inspiration comes from seeing someone refuse to accept mistreatment just because it's coming from people she loves, and from watching her reclaim her power and dignity through strategic action rather than hoping other people would suddenly develop consideration and empathy they'd never shown before. The practical guidance comes from understanding how Eleanor had positioned herself throughout her life to have choices when those choices became necessary for her well-being and self-respect. If you're supporting someone financially in any way, maintain control over those resources and the terms under which they're provided, rather than signing them over completely and hoping your generosity will be appreciated. If you're providing ongoing help, services, or support, make sure they're genuinely appreciated rather than simply expected, and be willing to adjust your level of availability if your contributions aren't being valued appropriately. If you're always the one accommodating, adjusting, or sacrificing in a relationship, start requiring some reciprocity and consideration for your own needs and preferences before resentment builds to levels that damage the relationship permanently. And most importantly, remember that teaching people how to treat you isn't cruel, selfish, or unreasonable. It's necessary for maintaining relationships where everyone's dignity is respected and protected. People who truly care about you will adjust their behavior when they understand it's hurting you, or when they realize they've been taking you for granted. People who don't care about you as much as they care about the benefits you provide will resist that adjustment and try to convince you that your expectations are the problem, that you're being too sensitive, or that you should be grateful for whatever level of consideration they feel like providing. Eleanor's story is ultimately about the power that comes from understanding your own worth and refusing to accept treatment that doesn't reflect that worth, regardless of who's providing the poor treatment or what excuses they offer for their behavior. It's about recognizing when kindness becomes enabling, when family loyalty becomes family exploitation, and when maintaining peace requires sacrificing so much of yourself that the peace isn't worth maintaining. The transformation we're about to witness, from abandoned grandmother to powerful woman commanding respect and attention, didn't happen because Eleanor became a different person overnight. It happened because she finally decided to stop hiding how much power she'd always had in deference to other people's comfort and convenience. She stopped pretending that her resources, her time, and her emotional labor were unlimited and available without consideration for her own needs and dignity. But before we see exactly how Eleanor executed her strategic plan and watch Sarah and Michael realize what they'd lost when they chose to abandon her in the rain, we need to understand more about the foundation Eleanor had built over 7 decades of life experience. We need to see how a girl from South Boston had become a woman with the resources, connections, and strategic thinking necessary to completely reverse the power dynamics in her family relationships in less than 48 hours. Because Eleanor's power didn't come from anger, vindictiveness, or a desire to hurt people who'd hurt her. It came from a lifetime of making smart decisions, building valuable relationships, maintaining her independence and dignity, and understanding that respect is something you have to require, rather than something you can hope other people will volunteer when it's convenient for them. The woman who opened her phone that Tuesday evening at Union Station wasn't just a hurt grandmother deciding to lash out at ungrateful family members who disappointed her. She was a strategic thinker with 7 decades of experience dealing with people who mistake kindness for weakness, someone who understood exactly how to demonstrate that actions have consequences, and someone who'd finally reached the point where teaching her family about respect and consideration had become more important than enabling their disrespectful and inconsiderate behavior. Eleanor Catherine Whitmore was about to show Sarah and Michael what happens when someone who's been underestimated decides it's time to reveal their true capabilities and options. And by the time she was finished with her response, they would never again make the mistake of thinking that someone's age, gender, or willingness to be generous meant they could be treated as disposable or that their feelings and dignity were negotiable. The lesson Eleanor was about to teach would change not just her relationship with her family, but her relationship with herself and her understanding of what she was capable of when pushed too far. She was about to discover that the most liberating feeling in the world is finally deciding that other people's opinion of your response to their mistreatment matters less than your own respect for your dignity and worth. But the real power of Eleanor's story, more transformative than any luxury train car or viral social media response, is that it shows us what's possible when we stop accepting unacceptable behavior and start requiring the respect we deserve, regardless of whether that respect comes from family members, friends, or strangers. So make sure you're subscribed and that notification bell is rung, because Eleanor's transformation is just getting started, and what happens next is going to surprise everyone, including Eleanor herself, who's about to discover capabilities and strength she never knew she possessed. The abandoned grandmother is about to become the most powerful person in her family, and Union Station is about to become the setting for the most strategic response to family mistreatment you've ever heard. Eleanor Whitmore's real masterclass in dignity and consequences is about to begin, and you won't want to miss a single strategic move in this incredible transformation. Now that you understand why Eleanor's story matters to everyone watching this video, I want to dive deeper into something that most people never fully grasp, until they find themselves in Eleanor's exact situation: the difference between being genuinely loved and being conveniently used by the people closest to you. Because what happened to Eleanor at Union Station wasn't just about one afternoon of abandonment in a thunderstorm, it was the culmination of a psychological transformation that happens in millions of families around the world, where one person's value gets systematically reduced to their utility, and their dignity becomes negotiable as long as the benefits they provide remain intact and easily accessible. The stakes in Eleanor's story extend far beyond one family's dynamics at a train station during bad weather. What we're really talking about here is a fundamental question that affects every single relationship in your life, whether you realize it or not. At what point do you stop accepting unacceptable behavior from people who claim to love you? At what point do you recognize that your attempts to maintain harmony and keep the peace are actually enabling other people's disrespect and teaching them that treating you badly has no real consequences? And most crucially, at what point do you understand that the most loving thing you can do for people who are taking you for granted is to stop being available for them to take for granted? These aren't just philosophical questions that sound good in motivational videos. They're practical challenges that determine whether you live your life as someone who commands respect or someone who hopes for it. They determine whether your relationships are based on mutual consideration and genuine care, or on one-sided accommodation where you provide all the flexibility while other people provide all the demands. And they determine whether you teach people that treating you well is optional when it's convenient, or required as the basic foundation for having access to your time, energy, and resources. Eleanor's story demonstrates what happens when someone finally answers these questions decisively, but to understand why her response was so effective and why it created such dramatic and lasting change in her family dynamics, we need to understand something that most people never learn until it's too late: the psychology of entitlement and how it develops in relationships where one person consistently prioritizes everyone else's comfort, convenience, and preferences over their own dignity and well-being. You see, Sarah and Michael hadn't started their marriage planning to exploit Eleanor, and they hadn't consciously decided to turn her into a convenient resource rather than a valued family member. In fact, during those early years when Eleanor was helping with childcare and contributing to their financial security, they'd probably felt genuinely grateful for her support and appreciated having such a helpful, generous mother and mother-in-law who made their lives significantly easier and more comfortable. The problem was that they'd gradually stopped thinking of Eleanor's contributions as choices she was making out of love and generosity, and started thinking of them as services she provided, because that was simply her role in their family structure. This transformation happens so slowly and subtly that the people involved rarely recognize it's occurring, and by the time the shift is complete, it feels natural and normal to everyone except the person whose contributions are being taken for granted. It starts with appreciation for unexpected help and generosity. It progresses to anticipation of reliable support that you begin to count on for your planning and decision-making. It evolves into expectation of continued assistance that becomes part of your baseline assumptions about how your life works. Eventually, it reaches a point where the support is simply expected without question, and the person providing it is valued more for their utility than for their worth as an individual human being with their own needs, preferences, and dignity. The insidious nature of this progression is that each step feels reasonable and justified in isolation, especially when you're the person benefiting from someone else's generosity and availability. When Sarah asked Eleanor to babysit Victoria and James so she and Michael could have a date night, that request probably felt normal and appropriate. Grandparents often enjoy spending time with their grandchildren, and new parents deserve occasional breaks from childcare responsibilities. When they began planning family activities and social events around Eleanor's availability to help with childcare, that might have seemed like efficient family coordination that made sense for everyone involved. When they started making decisions about Eleanor's involvement in family plans based on their convenience rather than consulting her preferences first, they probably told themselves they were just being practical and managing logistics in the most efficient way possible. But what Sarah and Michael had actually done over the course of 4 years was systematically retrain themselves to think of Eleanor as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be considered. They'd grown comfortable with making plans that assumed her availability without consulting her preferences or schedule first. They'd developed habits of expecting her accommodation without offering reciprocal consideration for her needs, interests, or limitations. Most importantly, they'd convinced themselves that Eleanor's role in their lives was to make things easier and more convenient for them, rather than to be loved, respected, and valued as an individual with her own life, priorities, and dignity. This is why Eleanor's attempts at communication about her growing concerns had been so consistently unsuccessful over the months and years leading up to the train station incident. When someone has unconsciously redefined your role as service provider rather than family member, your feedback about their treatment of you doesn't register as legitimate relationship concerns that deserve attention and adjustment. Instead, it gets interpreted as complaints about job responsibilities, requests for appreciation that seem unreasonable given what they perceive as a mutually beneficial arrangement, or evidence that you're becoming difficult and demanding in your old age. Sarah's response to Eleanor's concerns about being abandoned at Union Station, telling her she was making a bigger deal out of this than necessary, and that she should have been more understanding about tight travel schedules, perfectly illustrates this mindset. From Sarah's perspective, Eleanor had been asked to meet them at the train station and handle her own luggage like any other adult traveler, which should have been a perfectly reasonable expectation even for a 70-year-old woman. The fact that Eleanor felt abandoned, disrespected, and hurt by being left behind in a thunderstorm seemed like an overreaction to what Sarah viewed as a minor logistical issue that could have been avoided if Eleanor had simply moved faster or been more understanding about the realities of train, schedules, and travel logistics. Sarah couldn't see, or chose not to see, that Eleanor hadn't agreed to serve as an independent traveler who was responsible for keeping up with a group that included people 30 years younger. She'd expected to travel as part of a family group where everyone looked out for everyone else's well-being and made sure no one was left behind, especially during bad weather. The train station incident had crystallized something for Eleanor that had been building for 4 years since Robert's death. The recognition that her family's love for her had become entirely conditional on her willingness to provide services, support, and financial contributions while requiring minimal consideration, accommodation, or respect in return. They loved the grandmother who babysat on demand without consulting her own schedule. They appreciated the mother-in-law who contributed financially to their lifestyle without asking questions about how the money was being used. They valued the family member who accommodated their schedules, preferences, and convenience without expecting reciprocal consideration for her own needs and limitations. but they had no patience, understanding, or accommodation for the woman who had her own needs, preferences, physical limitations, and expectations of respectful treatment. They had no interest in considering how their decisions affected her well-being, comfort, or dignity. And they had no appreciation for the person behind the services. They only valued what Eleanor could do for them, not who she was as an individual. Human being who deserved consideration and respect regardless of what she provided to their family. This realization is one of the most painful experiences a person can have, particularly when it involves family members who are supposed to love you unconditionally. It's the moment when you understand that the people you've sacrificed for, supported, financially, and prioritized above your own interests don't actually see you as someone whose feelings matter as much as their convenience. It's when you recognize that your value in their lives is entirely tied to what you can do for them rather than who you are as a person, and that their affection and attention are contingent on your continued usefulness rather than based on genuine love and respect. For many people, this recognition leads to a kind of desperate escalation, where they try even harder to earn the love and respect they're missing. They become more accommodating, more generous, more available, hoping that if they just provide enough value and make themselves indispensable enough, they'll eventually be treated with the consideration and appreciation they deserve. But what they discover is that increasing their service and accommodation doesn't increase the respect they receive. It actually reinforces the dynamic that created the problem in the first place, by confirming that their role is to provide while others receive. Eleanor's genius was recognizing that she couldn't earn respect from people who'd decided she didn't deserve it, and that no amount of additional service or accommodation would change how Sarah and Michael viewed her fundamental worth and importance. Instead of trying harder to please people who demonstrated they were impossible to please in any sustainable way, she made the strategic decision to demonstrate exactly what their lives looked like without the benefits they'd been taking for granted. But Eleanor's response wasn't just about teaching her family a lesson or getting revenge for years of poor treatment. It was about reclaiming her own sense of worth, dignity, and power in relationships that had become completely one-sided. Over the 4 years since Robert's death, Eleanor had gradually allowed herself to become smaller, less demanding, and more accommodating in deference to other people's comfort and convenience. She'd accepted less consideration, tolerated more disrespect, and accommodated more inconvenience because she'd been afraid that requiring better treatment might result in losing her family relationships entirely. What Eleanor discovered that evening at Union Station was something that many people never learn, even after decades of unsatisfying relationships. That relationships based on fear of loss rather than mutual respect aren't actually worth preserving. That family connections maintained through constant accommodation and self-sacrifice aren't genuine connections at all, but rather arrangements where one person provides everything while the other person takes everything. And that sometimes the most liberating and empowering thing you can do is stop being afraid of losing people who've already demonstrated they don't value you properly. The decision Eleanor made to upgrade her travel experience and share her story publicly represented a fundamental shift in how she understood her own power, worth, and options in life. Instead of continuing to accept mistreatment because she was afraid of the consequences of demanding better, she decided to create consequences for people who treated her badly and see what happened when she stopped prioritizing their comfort over her own dignity. This shift from fear-based accommodation to requirement-based boundaries is one of the most transformative decisions a person can make at any age. But it's particularly powerful when it comes from someone who's spent decades prioritizing other people's needs and preferences. It changes not just how others treat you, but how you see yourself, what you believe you deserve, and what you're willing to accept in your relationships. It moves you from a position of hoping people will choose to treat you well to a position of requiring that they do so if they want to maintain access to your time, energy, resources, and presence in their lives. But making this shift requires understanding something that our culture often doesn't teach us, particularly women, and particularly older adults, that your comfort, dignity, and well-being matter just as much as everyone else's. That your needs and preferences deserve consideration, even when accommodating them requires other people to make adjustments or compromises. That your time and energy are valuable resources that deserve appreciation, rather than being treated as unlimited and freely available. And that love without respect isn't actually love at all. It's exploitation disguised as family obligation or relationship dynamics. Eleanor's story is particularly powerful because it demonstrates these principles in action with someone who had every reason to maintain the status quo and avoid conflict. She was 70 years old, living alone, financially comfortable, but not wanting to seem demanding or difficult. She had grandchildren she loved and wanted to maintain relationships with. She had a daughter whose approval and affection mattered to her. She had every incentive to continue accommodating, adjusting, and hoping that things would improve on their own. But Eleanor also had something that many people in similar situations lack: a clear understanding of her own worth that wasn't dependent on other people's approval or appreciation. She had financial independence that gave her options when options became necessary. She had life experience that helped her recognize unhealthy patterns and understand that some problems don't resolve themselves through patience and accommodation. And she had the wisdom that comes from 7 decades of observing how relationships work when they're healthy versus when they're exploitative. Most importantly, Eleanor had reached the point in her life where protecting her own dignity had become more important than protecting other people from the consequences of treating her badly. She was no longer willing to sacrifice her self-respect to maintain relationships that required her to accept unacceptable treatment, and she was no longer afraid of losing people who demonstrated they didn't value her properly. The brilliance of Eleanor's strategy, which we'll see in detail as her story continues, was that it was entirely within her rights and completely proportional to the treatment she'd received. She hadn't done anything vindictive, illegal, or disproportionately harsh. She'd simply stopped providing benefits to people who'd demonstrated they didn't value the person providing them. She'd withdrawn her financial support from people who'd shown they were willing to abandon her when helping her became slightly inconvenient. And she'd shared her experience publicly not to shame them, but to demonstrate that age doesn't mean you have to accept mistreatment, and that family relationships require mutual respect to remain healthy and sustainable. But the effectiveness of Eleanor's response also demonstrates something crucial about power dynamics in relationships: that people who exploit others' kindness and generosity often have no idea how dependent they've become on that kindness until it disappears completely. Sarah and Michael had grown so accustomed to Eleanor's financial contributions, childcare assistance, and emotional accommodation that they'd stopped thinking of these things as gifts she was choosing to provide. Instead, they'd unconsciously come to see them as natural features of their relationship with her, permanent benefits that would continue regardless of how they treated the person providing them. This is why Eleanor's withdrawal of support was so shocking and destabilizing. For them, they weren't just losing financial benefits and practical assistance. They were having to confront the reality that their comfortable lifestyle had been significantly dependent on maintaining a respectful, appreciative relationship with someone they'd been treating disrespectfully and taking for granted. They were discovering that the grandmother they'd dismissed as a convenient resource was actually indispensable to the life they'd been enjoying. The psychological impact of this discovery cannot be overstated. Sarah and Michael had to simultaneously recognize that they'd been mistreating someone they claimed to love, acknowledge that their behavior had been unacceptable and unsustainable, and accept that the consequences of their actions were entirely their own responsibility. They couldn't blame Eleanor for being too sensitive or overreacting because her response was completely logical, proportional, and within her rights as an independent adult with her own resources and agency. More importantly, they had to confront the fact that Eleanor had been choosing to be generous, accommodating, and available, not because she had no other options or because she was obligated to serve their family, but because she'd wanted to support people she loved. The moment they made that support unpleasant, disrespectful, and unrewarding for her, she'd simply chosen to stop providing it and redirect her time, energy, and resources toward people and experiences that treated her with the dignity and appreciation she deserved. This realization forced them to understand that all of Eleanor's previous accommodations, financial contributions, and availability had been gifts freely given out of love and generosity, not obligations she owed them or services they were entitled to receive. And gifts can be withdrawn when the recipients demonstrate they don't value the gift giver enough to treat them with basic respect and consideration. For viewers watching Eleanor's story, the stakes are both deeply personal and universally relevant. On a personal level, this story challenges you to examine your own relationships honestly and ask yourself some difficult questions. Are there people in your life who've grown comfortable taking your kindness, generosity, or availability for granted? Are you providing support, accommodation, financial assistance, or emotional labor to people who don't reciprocate consideration for your needs, feelings, and limitations? Have you convinced yourself that maintaining peace and harmony in your relationships requires accepting treatment that diminishes your dignity and self-respect? On a universal level, Eleanor's story represents a broader cultural shift in how we think about family obligations, relationship dynamics, and the responsibilities that come with different life stages. The old model suggested that love meant endless accommodation without reciprocity, that family loyalty required accepting any level of treatment without complaint, and that maintaining relationships was always more important than maintaining self-respect and personal boundaries. Eleanor's story suggests a different model, that genuine love includes mutual respect and consideration, that family loyalty should be reciprocal rather than one-sided, and that relationships worth maintaining are relationships where everyone's dignity is protected and valued. This model doesn't require perfection from anyone, and it doesn't mean cutting people off for minor flaws or occasional inconsideration. But it does require basic respect, appreciation, and consideration for the people who contribute to your life and well-being. The transformation we're about to witness in Eleanor's story isn't just about one woman standing up to entitled family members who took her for granted. It's about what becomes possible when people stop accepting unacceptable behavior and start requiring the respect they deserve. It's about the power that comes from understanding your own worth and refusing to negotiate that worth based on other people's convenience, comfort, or immediate desires. But Eleanor's story also demonstrates something else that's crucial for anyone considering similar action in their own lives: the importance of being prepared for people to test your boundaries and challenge your new expectations. When someone who's been exploiting your kindness suddenly faces real consequences for their behavior, their first response is rarely acceptance, apology, and behavior change. Instead, they typically try to convince you that your expectations are unreasonable, your boundaries are selfish, and your consequences are unfair or disproportionate. This is exactly what Sarah and Michael would attempt to do when they realized Eleanor was serious about changing the dynamics of their relationship, and that she had both the resources and the determination to follow through on her boundaries. They would try to minimize the significance of their behavior at the train station, appeal to Eleanor's love for her grandchildren, and pressure her to return to the previous arrangement where she provided benefits while they provided minimal consideration in return. Eleanor's ability to maintain her new boundaries in the face of this pressure, manipulation, and emotional appeals would determine whether her strategic response created lasting change or just temporary inconvenience that could be waited out until she returned to her previous accommodating patterns. And that ability would depend on something she'd been building her entire life without fully realizing it: the deep conviction that her dignity was not negotiable, regardless of who was asking her to compromise it or what justifications they offered for their poor treatment. The woman who'd grown up watching her immigrant parents build respect through consistency, integrity, and hard work, who'd married a man who treated her as an equal partner for 30 years, and who'd raised a daughter to value character over convenience, had always possessed the strength and wisdom necessary to require respectful treatment from everyone in her life. What had changed wasn't Eleanor's capacity for demanding respect. It was her willingness to do so even when the disrespect was coming from people she loved deeply and wanted to maintain relationships with. This distinction is crucial because it reveals something important about Eleanor's transformation and what made her response so effective. She wasn't becoming a different person or developing new capabilities overnight. She was finally allowing herself to be the person she'd always been. She wasn't learning new skills or discovering hidden strengths. She was applying skills and strengths she'd always possessed to a situation where she'd previously chosen accommodation over assertion, peace over justice, and relationship maintenance over self-respect. The power Eleanor was about to demonstrate had always been there, developed over 7 decades of making smart decisions, building valuable relationships, maintaining her independence and dignity, and understanding how healthy relationships work when both people have agency and self-respect. What was new was her decision to use that power instead of hiding it in deference to other people's comfort and her fear of conflict or relationship loss. That decision would change not just how Sarah and Michael treated her, but how she understood her own capacity to shape the relationships and circumstances of her life. She was about to discover that respect isn't something you have to earn through increasingly desperate acts of service and accommodation. It's something you require as the basic foundation for allowing people access to your time, energy, and resources. The abandoned grandmother was about to become a woman who commanded respect, not because she demanded it aggressively or manipulatively, but because she required it as the natural price of access to her love, generosity, and presence in people's lives. And Sarah and Michael were about to learn that taking someone for granted isn't a sustainable strategy when that someone has options, resources, independence, and the wisdom that comes from 7 decades of understanding exactly how relationships are supposed to work when both people have dignity and worth. Eleanor Whitmore's real education was about to begin, not for her, but for the family members who'd forgotten that love without respect isn't love at all, and that generosity without appreciation is just exploitation with a family label attached to it. Union Station was about to become the setting for the most important lesson Sarah and Michael would ever learn about the difference between being genuinely loved and being conveniently used. And Eleanor was about to discover that the most empowering feeling in the world is finally deciding that teaching people how to treat you is more important than protecting them from the consequences of treating you badly. The transformation was about to begin, and it would surprise everyone. Most of all, Eleanor herself, who was about to discover capabilities, strength, and strategic thinking she never knew she possessed when someone finally pushed her past the point of accommodation and into the realm of consequence and accountability. That Tuesday evening, sitting in a cramped taxi while her soaked clothes clung to her 70-year-old frame and her luggage dripped rainwater onto the cab floor, Eleanor Catherine Whitmore pulled out her phone and began what would become the most strategic and transformative 72 hours of her life. But before I tell you exactly what she did and how it completely reversed the power dynamics in her family, while creating a viral sensation that would inspire millions of people around the world, I want you to understand that what Eleanor executed wasn't driven by anger, revenge, or wounded pride. What you're about to witness was a carefully calculated demonstration of consequences, a masterclass in teaching people that their actions have direct, unavoidable, and proportional results. The first thing Eleanor did was research, and she approached it with the same methodical precision she'd used throughout her career as a portfolio manager at Northern Trust. For 4 hours that evening, while her clothes dried and her resolve strengthened, she explored Amtrak's premium services, luxury, accommodations, and exclusive experiences that most travelers never even know exist. She discovered that the Acela first-class service to New York, the same route Sarah's family was taking in coach the following day, offered spacious seats, gourmet meals, complimentary beverages, and personal service that would make their experience look like traveling in a cargo compartment. But Eleanor wasn't just planning a comfortable travel upgrade. She was designing a visual demonstration of exactly what Sarah and Michael had taken for granted and what they were about to lose forever. Every element of her plan was carefully chosen to illustrate a specific point about respect, appreciation, and the consequences of treating generous people as expendable resources who could be abandoned when their presence became inconvenient. More importantly, Eleanor was about to reveal something that Sarah and Michael had never fully understood: that their comfortable lifestyle, their financial security, and their ability to take luxury family vacations had been significantly subsidized by a woman they'd just demonstrated they were willing to abandon in a thunderstorm rather than provide basic assistance with her luggage. At 11:23 p.m., Eleanor called Amtrak's premium customer service line. "This is Eleanor Whitmore," she said with the confidence that comes from having $2.8 million in assets and the wisdom to use them strategically. "I need to book a first class Acela ticket to New York tomorrow morning, and I'll need several premium services arranged. Money is absolutely no object, and I need this handled immediately with your most experienced agent." Within 40 minutes, Eleanor had secured a first-class Acela seat on the same train Sarah's family would be riding in coach, arranged for premium lounge access, booked a luxury suite at the St. Regis, New York, and scheduled a private shopping experience at Bergdorf Goodman. The total cost for her upgraded experience would be over $8,000 for 3 days, exactly twice what Sarah and Michael had budgeted for their entire family vacation, and money they would soon discover they no longer had access to. But Eleanor's strategy went far beyond just upgrading her own travel experience. At 12:47 a.m., she called her private banker at Northern Trust and initiated a series of financial moves that would demonstrate exactly how much of Sarah and Michael's comfortable lifestyle had been dependent on her quiet generosity. She canceled the automatic transfers that had been funding Victoria and James's college accounts. Contributions of $1,500 per month per child that Sarah and Michael had apparently forgotten were coming from Eleanor's resources rather than their own savings or financial planning. She froze the $75,000 credit line she'd established for Sarah's boutique expansion, a business loan that had allowed Sarah to upgrade her inventory, hire additional staff, and move to a prime downtown location that had tripled her revenue over the past 18 months. She canceled the automatic payment for the European river cruise she'd been secretly funding, a $18,000 family vacation scheduled for the following month that Sarah and Michael had been planning for over a year. Most significantly, Eleanor canceled the life insurance policy she'd been paying on herself with Sarah and Michael listed as beneficiaries, a $500,000 policy that represented their inheritance and financial security in case something happened to Eleanor. She also sent a formal notice to her estate planning attorney requesting a complete revision of her will to remove Sarah and Michael as primary beneficiaries and redirect her assets to charitable organizations focused on elder advocacy and senior empowerment. Eleanor also sent a brief, professional email to Sarah and Michael's financial advisor, a family friend who'd been managing some shared investments and helping coordinate their retirement planning. "Please note that effective immediately, I'll be withdrawing from all shared financial arrangements with Sarah and Michael Rodriguez. I'll be working with my own advisory team going forward to manage my assets independently. Please ensure all joint accounts are closed and any automatic transfers are terminated. Thank you for your previous assistance with these arrangements." But the masterstroke of Eleanor's strategy was her decision to document and share her upgraded travel experience publicly in a way that would create accountability and demonstrate to the world exactly what kind of person Sarah and Michael had chosen to abandon. At 1:33 a.m., she created an Instagram account called Eleanor First Class and crafted her first post with the kind of strategic precision that comes from understanding exactly how to make a point that cannot be ignored or dismissed. The post featured a photo of her modest hotel room after the day's events, with a caption that would soon go viral and inspire thousands of similar stories. After being abandoned at Union Station in a thunderstorm today by my daughter and son-in-law because helping me with my luggage would have made them miss their connection, I decided to show myself what real travel luxury looks like. Tomorrow, I'm taking the same train they're on, but in first class while they sit in coach. Sometimes the best family is the one you create by valuing yourself. Our Union Station abandoned. First class grandma, know your worth, senior power, respect your elders. What Eleanor understood, and what Sarah and Michael were about to learn in the most public and humiliating way possible, was that in today's social media, world public accountability creates pressure that private conversations never can. Eleanor wasn't trying to shame her family into better behavior through social media exposure. She was creating a situation where their treatment of her would become visible to their community, their professional networks, their children's friends, parents, and potentially millions of people who would judge their character based on how they treated a 70-year-old woman who'd been supporting their lifestyle. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp Chicago weather that makes everything seem possible and full of potential. Eleanor woke up in her hotel room for what she'd decided would be the last time she ever accommodated other people's poor treatment of her. She ordered a luxurious room service breakfast, charged it to the credit card that Sarah and Michael would soon discover was no longer available to them, and began preparing for her transformation from abandoned grandmother to first-class viral sensation. At 8:30 a.m., Eleanor arrived at Union Station dressed in an elegant outfit she'd purchased online the night before and had delivered to her hotel, a sophisticated ensemble that would photograph beautifully for the social media documentation she was planning. She proceeded directly to the Amtrak Metropolitan Lounge, an exclusive space for premium passengers that offered complimentary food, beverages, and comfortable seating away from the crowded general waiting areas. Meanwhile, Sarah and Michael were discovering their first indication that something fundamental had changed in their relationship with Eleanor. Their credit card was declined when they tried to purchase upgraded breakfast at the station cafe. When Michael called the credit card company, he learned that the account had been closed by the primary cardholder, Eleanor, effective immediately. Their second shock came when Sarah tried to check their bank account and discovered that the automatic transfers they'd been receiving for Victoria and James's college funds had been canceled. The accounts were still accessible, but no new money would be added unless Sarah and Michael began making the contributions themselves from their own significantly more limited resources. The third and most devastating discovery came when Michael checked his email and found a message from their travel agent. "I'm sorry to inform you that your European River Cruise reservation has been canceled due to non-payment. The credit card on file has been declined, and the cancellation fee has been charged to the account as per the terms of your booking. You'll need to make alternative arrangements if you still wish to travel." At 9:15 a.m., Eleanor's train was called for boarding. She proceeded to the first-class car with the kind of calm dignity that comes from finally understanding your own power and worth. Her seat was spacious, comfortable, and positioned perfectly for the social media documentation she was planning. As she settled in with a complimentary glass of champagne, she began documenting her experience for the growing audience that was already following her story. Her first post from the train went viral within hours. "Boarding the same train as my daughter's family, but traveling first class while they're in coach 3 cars behind me. The irony? They abandoned me yesterday because I was too slow with my luggage, but they have no idea I've been paying for their family vacations for years." Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor. By 10 a.m., Eleanor's posts were being shared by her friends from her senior community in Evanston, who were delighted to see her standing up for herself and refusing to accept mistreatment. By 11 a.m., local Chicago social media accounts had picked up her story. By noon, her posts had been shared over 5,000 times, with comments pouring in from people who related to her experience of being taken for granted by family members. The viral nature of Eleanor's story created exactly the kind of public pressure and accountability that Sarah and Michael couldn't ignore or dismiss. Their friends, neighbors, colleagues, and professional contacts were seeing Eleanor's posts and asking questions. Sarah's business associates at her boutique were commenting on the situation and sharing the story with their own networks. Michael's co-workers were forwarding the posts and making observations about family values, respect for parents, and the importance of treating seniors with dignity. More importantly, Victoria and James's friends at school had parents who were following Eleanor's story, which meant the children were hearing comments and questions about why their grandmother was traveling alone in luxury while their family was struggling with canceled vacations and declined credit cards. The public nature of the situation made it impossible for Sarah and Michael to simply wait for Eleanor to get over her feelings and return to the previous arrangement where they could take her generosity for granted. Meanwhile, Eleanor was enjoying her first-class experience and documenting every moment for her rapidly growing social media audience. Her lunch post featuring gourmet cuisine while overlooking the Hudson River landscape became her most viral content yet. Having a spectacular lunch in the dining car while my daughter's family eats gas station sandwiches in Coach. They're probably wondering why their usual credit cards aren't working. Plot twist. I've been the one paying those bills for 4 years. Chur first-class lunch. Chuck chur pay your own way. Shart respect has consequences. The post was shared over 15,000 times within 6 hours, with major social media accounts featuring Eleanor's story as an example of senior empowerment and the importance of standing up to family members who take you for granted. Comments poured in from people praising Eleanor's courage, sharing their own stories of family mistreatment, and celebrating her decision to prioritize her own dignity and comfort. By the time the train arrived in New York, Eleanor's following had grown to over 100,000 people, with local news stations reaching out for interviews and senior advocacy organizations wanting to feature her story. She'd become an unexpected spokesperson for the millions of older adults who were being taken for granted by their families and didn't know how to reclaim their power and dignity. But the most significant development came when Sarah and Michael finally appeared at Eleanor's luxury hotel suite that evening, having spent the day tracking down her location and working up the courage to confront their new reality. They'd had 8 hours to discover the full scope of the financial support they'd lost, to experience what traveling and dining felt like without Eleanor's subsidies, and to read the thousands of comments from people who were judging their character based on Eleanor's public account of their behavior. Eleanor was on the terrace of her suite, enjoying a glass of wine and the Manhattan skyline, when the concierge called to inform her that her daughter and son-in-law were in the lobby requesting to speak with her urgently. Please inform them that I'm enjoying a private evening after a wonderful day of first-class travel, Eleanor told the concierge with the kind of calm authority that comes from finally understanding your own worth and power. If they'd like to schedule an appointment to discuss their treatment of me and the financial arrangements they've apparently taken for granted, they can contact my assistant tomorrow morning. Your assistant, Mrs. Whitmore? Yes. Please give them this number. Eleanor provided the contact information for Diana Walsh, her estate planning attorney, whom she'd briefed that morning about the situation, and who'd agreed to mediate any discussions about potentially restoring financial arrangements under completely different terms and conditions. The message was clear and unmistakable. Eleanor was no longer available for desperate phone calls, emotional manipulation, or pressure to return to arrangements that had been harmful to her dignity and self-respect. If Sarah and Michael wanted to discuss restoring any aspect of their financial relationship, they would need to go through proper channels, acknowledge the seriousness of their behavior, and demonstrate genuine understanding of how their treatment of Eleanor had been unacceptable. Thursday morning brought the confrontation that would determine whether Eleanor's strategic response created lasting change or temporary inconvenience that could be waited out. Sarah and Michael, having spent a sleepless night in their budget hotel while Eleanor enjoyed luxury accommodations 40 floors above them, finally understood the full scope of what they'd lost and what they needed to do to have any hope of restoring it. The meeting took place in Diana Walsh's temporary office at the St. Regis, a conference room the attorney had arranged for the purpose of facilitating what she described as family financial mediation and boundary establishment. Eleanor arrived wearing another elegant outfit purchased during her Bergdorf Goodman shopping experience, carrying herself with the confidence and dignity that comes from finally understanding that respect is not negotiable. Sarah and Michael arrived looking exhausted, stressed, and humbled in a way that Eleanor had never seen before. For the first time in 4 years, they were approaching her as people who needed something rather than people who were entitled to her support. And the difference in their demeanor was remarkable. "Mom," Sarah began, but Diana Walsh interrupted, with the professional authority that Eleanor had hired her to provide. "Mrs. Whitmore," Diana said, consulting her notes with deliberate formality, "you've asked me to facilitate this discussion about the financial arrangements you'd been providing for your daughter's family, and whether those arrangements might be restored under different terms and conditions. Would you like to begin by explaining the circumstances that led to your decision to discontinue your previous support?" For the next 90 minutes, Eleanor calmly and methodically detailed 4 years of systematic marginalization, taking advantage of her generosity and increasing disrespect, culminating in the Union Station abandonment that had finally convinced her that Sarah and Michael valued her resources more than they respected her person. She explained how her attempts to address these issues through normal family communication had been dismissed, minimized, and ignored. Most importantly, she described how she'd finally understood that continuing to provide financial support to people who treated her disrespectfully was actually enabling their harmful behavior rather than encouraging them to change it. Sarah and Michael listened in stunned silence as Diana Walsh presented documentation of the financial support that had been quietly funding their lifestyle for 4 years. $3,000 per month in college fund contributions for Victoria and James, $75,000 in business credit for Sarah's boutique expansion, monthly payments on credit cards they'd assumed were being handled automatically by their bank, the $18,000 European cruise that had been canceled when Eleanor withdrew her support, and dozens of smaller contributions for family activities, emergency expenses, and luxury purchases. The total annual value of Mrs. Whitmore's financial contributions to your family, Diana explained with devastating precision, has been approximately $94,000 per year for the past 4 years. This doesn't include the $275,000 gift that helped you purchase your current home, the life insurance policy she'd been paying with you as beneficiaries, or the numerous smaller contributions for vacations, children's activities, and household expenses that weren't formally tracked. The numbers created a silence that stretched for several minutes as Sarah and Michael confronted the reality of how dependent their comfortable middle-class lifestyle had become on Eleanor's extraordinary generosity. Generosity they'd been taking for granted while treating her with increasing disrespect and inconsideration. "I want to be absolutely clear about something," Eleanor said when the silence became uncomfortable enough to demand a response. "This was never about money, and it's still not about money. You're both intelligent, capable adults who can build a good life without my financial support if you choose to do so. This is about respect, consideration, and basic human dignity. This is about recognizing that relationships require mutual care and consideration, even when one person is in a position to be more financially generous than the other." Sarah spoke for the first time since entering the room, her voice shaking, with what appeared to be genuine remorse and shock. "Mom, we had no idea you were contributing this much to our lives. We thought you were just helping out occasionally when we asked, not subsidizing our entire lifestyle." "No," Eleanor replied, with the kind of gentle firmness that comes from finally speaking truth without worrying about other people's comfort or feelings. "You knew exactly how much I was contributing, Sarah. You chose not to think about it because thinking about it would have required acknowledging that your treatment of me was unacceptable and unsustainable. It would have required recognizing that I was a person deserving of consideration, rather than just a resource to be managed around your convenience. Michael tried to defend their behavior, his voice containing the desperation of someone who was finally understanding the magnitude of what they'd lost. Eleanor, we never meant to take advantage of you. We just got busy with work and the kids. And maybe we didn't express our appreciation as clearly as we should have. But abandoning you at the train station, that was just a misunderstanding about timing and logistics. Michael, Eleanor said, looking directly at the man who'd married her daughter and had spent 4 years gradually learning to treat Eleanor as a convenient resource rather than a person deserving of respect. You didn't abandon me because of a misunderstanding about timing. You abandoned me because helping me with my luggage in the rain was less convenient than making your train connection. When I tried to explain how that felt and why it was unacceptable, you told me I was making too big a deal of it. That wasn't. Poor communication. That was a complete lack of respect for my dignity, well-being, and worth as a human being. Diana Walsh then presented the terms under which Eleanor might consider restoring some level of financial support, though she emphasized that these terms were provisional and would require sustained demonstration of changed behavior rather than just promises or temporary improvements. The terms were simple but non-negotiable. Sarah and Michael would need to demonstrate through their actions, not just their words, that they understood Eleanor's worth as a person rather than just her utility as a financial resource. This would require scheduled regular family time where Eleanor's preferences, comfort, and enjoyment were prioritized equally with everyone else's needs and wants. It would require genuine consultation about plans that affected her, rather than assumptions about her availability based on their convenience. Most importantly, it would require ongoing acknowledgement that Eleanor's contributions were choices she was making out of love and generosity, not obligations she owed them or services they were entitled to receive. Mrs. Whitmore is willing to consider gradually restoring some financial support, Diana explained with the precision of someone who'd spent decades helping families navigate complex relationship and financial dynamics, but only if she sees consistent evidence over a period of at least 6 months that your family's treatment of her has fundamentally and permanently changed. This isn't about perfect behavior or walking on eggshells. It's about basic respect, consideration, and appreciation for someone who's choosing to be extraordinarily generous with her time and resources. The meeting ended with Sarah and Michael, understanding that their relationship with Eleanor would never return to the previous arrangement, where they could take her generosity for granted while providing minimal consideration in return. If they wanted to rebuild any kind of financial relationship with Eleanor, they would first need to rebuild a respectful, appreciative personal relationship with her that demonstrated they valued her as a person rather than just as a source of financial support. Over the following months, Sarah and Michael had to learn how to treat Eleanor as someone whose feelings, preferences, and dignity mattered as much as their own convenience. They had to discover that appreciation needed to be expressed regularly and meaningfully, through actions rather than just assumed or expressed in words when they needed something. Most importantly, they had to understand that love without respect isn't love at all. It's exploitation disguised as family obligation, and it's ultimately harmful to everyone involved. The changes weren't immediate, automatic, or perfect. There were setbacks, arguments, and moments when old patterns tried to reassert themselves. Sarah struggled with accepting that her mother had independent thoughts, preferences, and boundaries that deserved consideration. Michael had difficulty adjusting to the reality that Eleanor was someone whose opinions mattered and whose comfort required accommodation rather than someone who should accommodate everyone else's needs without expecting reciprocity. But the fundamental dynamic had shifted permanently and irreversibly. Eleanor was no longer someone who hoped for respect and appreciation. She was someone who required it as the basic price of access to her time, energy, and resources. She was no longer afraid of losing relationships that required her to accept unacceptable treatment. and she was no longer willing to enable other people's poor behavior by continuing to provide benefits, regardless of how she was treated. 6. Months after the Union Station transformation, Victoria and James were thriving in their new dynamic with their grandmother. Instead of taking her availability for granted, they learned to appreciate the special time they spent with her and to understand that being with grandmother was a privilege that required consideration and good behavior. Instead of seeing her as convenient childcare, they began to understand her as someone with her own interesting life, experiences, wisdom, and stories to share. Sarah had to confront some difficult truths about how she'd allowed her marriage and her adult responsibilities to affect her relationship with her mother in harmful ways. She began creating space for one-on-one time with Eleanor, separate from Michael's influence and the demands of household management. Most importantly, she learned to advocate for her mother's dignity and comfort, even when that advocacy created inconvenience for her own schedule or preferences. Michael's transformation was the most dramatic and necessary. He had to recognize that his treatment of Eleanor had been guided by self-interest and convenience rather than family love and respect. He had to learn that appreciating someone's contributions meant considering their feelings and needs, not just benefiting from their generosity while providing minimal consideration in return. Most challenging of all, he had to accept that Eleanor's value to their family wasn't dependent on her utility to their lifestyle, but on her worth as a person who deserved love and respect regardless of what she provided. The European River Cruise was eventually rescheduled for the following year. But this time, Sarah and Michael paid for it themselves through careful saving and budgeting, and the itinerary was planned around activities and accommodations that everyone would enjoy rather than just the younger family members. Eleanor's presence was valued, and her preferences were consulted rather than assumed, and her comfort and enjoyment were considered equally important to everyone else's. Eleanor's Instagram account, Eleanor First Class, continued to inspire people around the world who were dealing with similar family dynamics and relationship challenges. Her posts about setting boundaries, requiring respect, understanding your own worth, and refusing to accept mistreatment resonated with millions of people who'd been struggling with exploitative relationships but didn't know how to change the dynamics without losing the relationships entirely. But more importantly, Eleanor had discovered something about herself that changed how she approached every relationship in her life going forward. That teaching people how to treat you isn't cruel, selfish, or unreasonable. It's necessary for maintaining relationships where everyone's dignity is respected and protected. That requiring appreciation and consideration doesn't damage good relationships. It preserves them and helps them flourish. And that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people who are taking you for granted is to stop being available, for them to take for granted until they learn to value what they've been receiving. Eleanor's story became a powerful reminder that age isn't a limitation. It's an accumulation of wisdom, resources, life experience, and the kind of strategic thinking that only comes from decades of understanding exactly how relationships are supposed to work when both people have dignity and worth. Her response to being abandoned demonstrated that seniors don't have to accept mistreatment just because it's coming from family members, and that having financial resources means having options when options become necessary for protecting your self-respect. The woman who'd been abandoned at Union Station had become someone who commanded respect not through demands, manipulation, or aggressive behavior, but through the simple act of valuing herself enough to require that others value her appropriately. Eleanor Whitmore had learned that real power isn't about making people afraid of you. It's about understanding your own worth and refusing to accept treatment that doesn't reflect that worth. Her story became a reminder that dignity is not negotiable, regardless of your age, your family situation, or how much you love the people who are mistreating you. That respect is not something you earn through increasingly desperate acts of service and accommodation. It's something you require as the foundation for allowing people access to your time, energy, and resources. And that sometimes, the most magical transformation of all is finally deciding that your well-being matters as much as everyone else's. Eleanor's Union Station experience had indeed been transformative, not because of the luxury travel or the viral social media response, but because it had been the setting for her metamorphosis from someone who hoped for respect to someone who required it. And that transformation had changed not just her relationship with her family, but her relationship with herself and her understanding of what she deserved in every area of her life. The train station had become the place where Eleanor Catherine Whitmore finally learned the most important lesson of all, that you teach people how to treat you by what you're willing to accept, and that sometimes the best gift you can give someone is the natural consequence of their own behavior. She'd discovered that love without respect isn't love at all, and that family relationships require the same standards of mutual consideration and dignity as any other healthy relationship. If you've made it this far in Eleanor's story, I want you to remember something crucial. You have more power than you realize to change the dynamics in your own relationships, regardless of your age, financial situation, or family circumstances. You don't have to accept disrespect from people just because you love them or because they're family members. You don't have to continue providing benefits, support, or accommodation to people who don't appreciate the person providing them. And you definitely don't have to sacrifice your dignity to maintain relationships that aren't based on mutual respect and consideration. Eleanor's story isn't just about one woman's triumph over entitled family members who took her for granted. It's about what becomes possible when you finally decide that your worth isn't negotiable, regardless of who's asking you to compromise it or what justifications they offer for their poor treatment. The principles Eleanor demonstrated can be adapted to any situation where you're being taken for granted, in family relationships, friendships, workplace dynamics, or romantic partnerships. You don't need to have millions of dollars or be able to afford first-class train tickets to require respect and consideration from the people in your life. What you need is the understanding that your dignity matters, the willingness to set and maintain boundaries, and the courage to follow through with consequences when those boundaries are violated. So make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because Eleanor's story is just one example of what happens when people stop accepting unacceptable behavior and start requiring the respect they deserve. And in the comments below, tell me about your own experiences with setting boundaries, requiring respect, and refusing to accept mistreatment from people who claim to love you. Your stories matter, and they might just inspire someone else to find their own courage to transform from someone who hopes for better treatment to someone who requires it. Remember, you are worth more than you've been accepting. You deserve better than you've been receiving. You have more power than you've been using. And sometimes, the most magical transformation of all is finally believing that truth enough to act on it with courage, strategy, and unwavering commitment to your own dignity. The magic was inside Eleanor all along. She just had to decide to use it. And the same magic is inside you, waiting for the moment when you decide that respect isn't optional, dignity isn't negotiable, and love without consideration isn't love at all. Eleanor's journey from abandoned grandmother to empowered woman proves that it's never too late to reclaim your power. Command the respect you deserve and show the world and yourself exactly what you're capable of when someone finally pushes you too far. The transformation is possible. The power is within you. The only question is, what are you going to do with it? Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.